Hey everybody, and welcome back to TYT Community. You of course know my esteemed co-host Rhiannon and Avaneen, and today we have an awesome special guest sitting on the panel with us,
Who?
Brad Friedman
Oh, damn. I
from
thought it was somebody else.
bradblog.com.
Hey, Jeff.
And today, it's great to have you here, as always.
Great to be had.
And today we're going to talk about something that Brad has actually been very, very vocal about in his writing, if you could be vocal while writing. You get my point, right?
And I am. If you've ever read my writing, you know that I am.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And anyway, it's about the Voting Rights Act that has been challenged in the Supreme Court. And I want to get right into it by talking about a little bit about what Antonin Scalia had said when it comes to his decision on the Voting Rights Act.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
Correct me if I'm doing anything wrong.
No, you can see how I'm chomping at the bit already because I'm so pissed off about what happened this weekend. Not just Scalia, by the way, and I'll get into the specifics about him and his hypocrisy and his lack of being a conservative and his lying about being a strict constitutionalist, a strict constructionist. But, you know, the complete idea that what we're seeing right now, this attack on the Voting Rights Act, particularly in a year after voting rights themselves have been under attack in state after state by Republicans who are trying to keep legal American voters from being able to cast their legal American vote. But what we saw this week in the Supreme Court, this attack on the Voting Rights Act, which very well may result in gutting the most important provision of that act, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And for people who don't know Section 5, what Section 5 does is that it requires some 16 jurisdictions, which is all or parts of some 16 states, many of them in the South, to get what is called pre-clearance for new election-related laws. So, for example, last year we saw with these polling place photo ID restrictions in Texas and in South Carolina, when those states passed those laws, they had to get pre-clearance from the Department of Justice or the federal courts before they could put these laws into practice. They have to show before the laws begin that the laws don't discriminate, don't racially discriminate. And the reason why these states were selected was because when the Voting Rights Act was enacted in 1965, these were states and jurisdictions that had a history of racial discrimination. So they have to prove before the law is put into place that the law itself will not discriminate. They have to get approval to do so. This has been a key, incredibly key law. It is our landmark civil rights law. This is the cornerstone of that civil rights law, is Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And that is now what is under fire, and what the right wing of the Supreme Court is saying needs to end. It's unfair because only these few states are targeted. You know, they never talk about expanding it to all of the states. Instead, they're saying we need to just kill it entirely. This is going to have an unspeakably dangerous effect on voting rights in this country. It has, the Voting Rights Act, in fact, has been a stunning success. It has been reauthorized 4 times since it was originally passed in 1965. Most recently, it was reauthorized in 2006 under George W. Bush. And to give you an idea of just how radically things have changed since 2006, back then when they were looking at reauthorizing this act, and they did reauthorize it for 25 more years, they looked at it for 10 months. They had 21 hearings in the Congress, more than 15,000 pages of evidence that was gathered, and they looked at it and they decided, is the Voting Rights Act still necessary? Specifically, is Section 5 still necessary? The verdict came back in 2006 as absolutely yes, it was necessary. It was voted, it was approved in the U.S. Senate 98-0 in the U.S. Senate before it was then signed by George W. Bush in a grand ceremony on the South Lawn of the White House with leaders from both parties, Republican and Democrat, there to celebrate this great bill that had been reauthorized for another 25 years. Since that has happened 6 years ago, the Republican Party, specifically Republican dark money Republican funders, have attacked Section 5, knowing that that is keeping them from suppressing the vote. And that's what we saw this week in the Supreme Court, was a hearing, Shelby County versus Eric Holder, and we can get into the actual specifics of that case and why that case came before the Supreme Court this week. But what we saw was Antonin Scalia referring to this as a perpetual racial entitlement, which is incredibly offensive, both inaccurate and offensive. But, you know, the idea that it's a racial entitlement for African Americans and for Hispanic voters and for other minorities to be able to vote is somehow now an entitlement in the thinking of Scalia. But more offensive in that same rant, and you can check it out, we have that particular rant at bradblog.com. More offensive to me was this notion that he put forward that it was because the law was passed by 98-0 in the U.S. Senate, that somehow that means the Supreme Court needs to come in and nullify this law, needs to take over from the legislative branch and the executive branch that passed this this law in 2006, because for some reason Republicans apparently and even the senators in those states that are covered are just too frightened somehow to vote against this law. That was the theory that he was putting forward, because they're afraid of being called racist or something like that. But so, you know, this guy who claims to be a strict constructionist is willing to bust up this whole idea of the separation of powers between the judiciary and the executive branch and the legislative branch. And that's what he was talking about doing. Here's the most offensive part to me of that. He says at some point during that rant that this is not a question that can be left to Congress. But if you look at the 15th Amendment, and the Voting Rights Act is specifically meant to enforce the 15th Amendment. 15th Amendment was passed in 1870 after the Civil War, and the 15th Amendment is the one that says you cannot discriminate against the right to vote based on race or color. That's the first section, one sentence of the 15th Amendment. It's only 2 sentences long. The second sentence reads that the Congress shall write the law to enforce this provision. It is specifically up to the Congress to write the law to enforce the 15th Amendment. And that's exactly what the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was meant to do. 95 years after the Voting Rights Act, 95 years after the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, we finally got the Voting Rights Act. And it put an end to the abridgment of the vote based on race and color that you found in things like poll taxes and literacy tests. Finally, in 1965, that's what we had. Congress did its job. And then move the clock forward 45 years later, Congress once again reauthorized that act by a stunning 98-0 margin in the U.S. Senate. They did their job. What's that?
And that never happens.
Never happened.
Would you ever see 98-0?
Finally, exactly. Finally, the Congress did its job and did it well. And by the way, it was led in the U.S. House Judiciary Committee. All of those hearings was led by James Sensenbrenner, for Christ's sake, a guy who I agree with on nothing, but he did the job correctly when it came to the Voting Rights Act. And because the Congress finally did its job correctly, that's when Antonin Scalia feels the judiciary needs to come in. The hell with separation of powers, the hell with the originalist, constructionist language of the 15th Amendment. The judiciary, for some reason, needs to come in and cancel everything that the Congress did. It's offensive. It underscores exactly why Antonin Scalia is not conservative. is not a strict constructionist, is not an originalist. He is nothing but a hypocrite and a liar, and apparently he just wants racial minorities not to be able to cast their vote in this country. Period.
Ooh, preach it, brother. Preach it.
I think one great myth in this country is are those that still try to convince people that the judiciary branch is nonpartisan in their interests.
No, I thought that,
unbiased.
I thought that you were actually going to say that racism is gone in this country. I was about to laugh.
Well, listen, that's what they actually argued, Jeff. In this court, if you read the transcript in this hearing on last Wednesday, that's what they argued. That's what Shelby County, Alabama argued, which was that the Voting Rights Act was a great act, a great law. It did its job. The problem has been solved. And those were the actual words that he used. The problem has been solved. Therefore, we no longer need Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So, the idea that Scalia here, and you hear this all the time from the right, we're against legislating from the bench, activist judges. That is exactly what Scalia is doing here. He is an activist judge legislating from the bench, changing a law that was duly passed in both the U.S. House by a huge margin and the U.S. Senate unanimously, and yet Scalia wants to be an activist judge and come in and legislate from the bench and rewrite the Voting Rights Act the way he rewrote campaign finance law and McCain-Feingold, etc., with the Citizens United decision. This is going to be unbelievably painful to this country if, in fact, the Supreme Court goes the way it looks like they may be going. And right now it's up to Justice Kennedy to do the right thing here, and it does not look good.
You're right. That's an absolute danger. I mean, Kennedy isn't exactly known for being a liberal justice or for being, for any sort of progressive ideals. I mean, he's a conservative justice, from what I understand, right?
Well, he's conservative on most things. There's certain things, certain social issues, gay rights that he's been good on in the past. He's clearly the swing justice here. But look, if they do away with Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, it was Section 5 that prevented the voter suppression bills in Texas and in South Carolina to require polling place photo ID restrictions before the 2012 election. It was Section 5 that stopped them. It was Section 5 that stopped some attempt at restricting early voting in the state of Florida. It was Section 5 that stopped the redistricting map in the state of Texas. Now, what they argue, what those who want to see that Section 5 done away with, is they argue that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which applies to all 50 states, can be used in cases like that. But here's the difference. Section 5 puts the burden of proof onto the jurisdictions themselves to prove that these new laws are not discriminatory before they're put in place. Section 2 is different. You have to wait essentially until you have until your right to vote has been abridged, and then you can bring a case. Then you can sue. You can say, well, my vote was suppressed, so I'm going to sue. But by then, it's done. The deed has been done. So the genius of Section 5 was that it made them prove in advance of putting that law into place that it would not be discriminatory in any way. And so if all that we're left with is Section 2, we're in trouble because we've got to wait until after it's taken effect. And then, by the way, if your vote is the one that is suppressed, good luck. You've got to come up with the money and the attorney and the resources to go to court and to bring the case to prove that you've been suppressed after it has already happened.
And by then your vote already does not count. Already your vote is lost.
That's right.
And then we may end up getting some, right-wing president. If it's a presidential election or if it's a local election, you could have your entire legislature stacked with people who are right wing because everyone else was disenfranchised.
Most people do not have the resources necessary to go and make a lawsuit out of it, let alone prove it. That's something that's very difficult to prove. It's like a woman trying to prove that she's been sexually discriminated against by being paid less for the same work. It's very difficult to prove. So, and let alone paying for a lawyer, which is going to be $3,000 at least right there, which most people do not have.
Well, that's right. And listen, Jeff makes an excellent point there. This is way bigger than just presidential elections. And this is one of the things that drives me crazy. Frankly, it drives me crazy about the Obama administration, too, that the Department of Justice was not more proactive in 2012 in bringing lawsuits in places that are not covered by Section 5. The Department of Justice can bring Section 2 lawsuits themselves, and they stood by while polling place photo ID restrictions were put into place in places like Kansas and like Tennessee. Somehow Tennessee is not covered by Section 5. I don't know how that can possibly be, but photo ID restrictions were put in place there, and the Obama administration did absolutely nothing about it. But the larger point is, it's not just presidential elections. The Shelby County case itself, the one that's being heard at the Supreme Court, comes out of a 2006 case in Shelby County where they had redistricted the county board, the board of supervisors, such that the one minority district there, which had been like 75% minority, was split up so that it was a 30% minority. That was the one African American district, and when they did that, the guy. The African American, the one African American on the county board who had a seat there, he ended up losing his seat by 2 votes. Now, this was despite the fact that the county is covered by Section 5. They went to the DOJ to get approval for this redistricting. The DOJ said, no, you can't do it. And they went ahead and did it anyway. The African-American representative lost his seat, supervisor lost his seat by 2 votes. This case then went to court, and eventually the county solved the problem by changing their elections from a district by district to at-large districts. So sort of everybody sort of votes at large for the county board of supervisors. And what do you know? This time, the guy who had lost his seat, the one African American on the board who had lost his seat after the redistricting, ended up winning his seat back. He won an at-large district seat. And as it turns out, he was the largest single vote getter in the entire election. And the guy who had beat him when they were monkeying with the redistricting, he was the lowest vote getter in the entire election. So it's not just presidential elections that are affected by the Voting Rights Act, by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. It is, in fact, county elections and city elections and municipal elections.
It's also not just minorities that are affected by these laws as well. It's every poor person, elderly person they are also very much affected by these voter ID laws, for instance. And there have been times where I was so poor that I couldn't afford to get an ID.
And of course,
of
course, you don't just have the Section 5 challenges in the South, but you've got other different methods, or I should say attempts, to mess with the votes in other states. Michigan, one of them, to try and change electoral votes.
Right. Yep. And
gerrymandering.
But that's what it's about. Yeah, gerrymandering, but that's what it's about. It's about an assault on voting rights. And, instead of coming up with policies that people might want to vote for, the Republican Party has just decided, well, you know what? It's easier to change the laws to keep people from voting, to restrict voters. It's easier to change the laws than it is to actually do things that people will like. And right now, the Voting Rights Act is getting in our way, particularly in the South. Particularly, it's getting in our way in state after state where we would would like to, restrict, jimmy the system to keep people from voting. So we've got to do away with the Voting Rights Act itself. First, it's going to be Section 5, and they very well may get rid of that. But believe me, it will be the entire Voting Rights Act itself if they can figure out a way to get rid of it instead of just, doing things that people actually like.
If they can figure it out, they will. And that is the same mentality as a bully on the playground when I think about it. It would be easier for them to actually be decent. It would be easy for them to be decent people and actually, for instance, the bully on the playground, if only they could be a decent person and make friends, then they wouldn't have to bully people around. But for them, it's easier to just force people to do what they want them to do and enforce their policies.
There's only so many times that you can polish that turd before you just have to say, you know what, I'm out of polish. I still got this turd sitting here. So you know what, I'm going to change the rules.
But remember, things have changed. This was, again, 2006. The Voting Rights Act was reauthorized for 25 years by 98-0 in the U.S. Senate. That's how much the Republican Party has changed in those 6 years.
So how much more fringe do you think that they could get? I mean,
Well, we thought they were fringe during the Bush years. We thought they were insane then. They've only gotten more insane, so...
Yes, don't taunt them, Jeff. Don't taunt them.
And I want to go back to this quote about racial entitlement. Racial entitlement. This coming from a guy, who's had the right to vote his entire life.
Right.
He's not a minority. He's had all the rights. He's never had to have to suffer any kind of racial discrimination, and yet he's calling this racial entitlement. And once again, it comes down to that word, entitlement, that they love to throw around. Everything's an entitlement. If you get something, it's an entitlement. But if it's for me, well, I'm an American. It's part of my heritage. It's part of my freedom. But if it's for you, and especially if it's somebody that I don't like or I don't want to vote, then it's an entitlement, and it needs to be taken away and done away with because it's wrong. It's not fair.
Well, entitlement. When did the word entitlement become a bad word? If you're entitled to it, then the assumption there is that you did something for it to be an entitlement. You are entitled to vote. It is an entitlement, but that's
right.
not a bad thing. Yes, you're entitled to it because it's your right. It's not a bad thing. It's not a bad word. They created it as a bad word. They made it into a bad word, the same way that they made liberal into a bad word.
It's a code. It's a code word. It's a code. When you say racial entitlement, it sounds like, oh, it's welfare, it's unemployment, it's something that these nasty racial people are in favor of. Yeah,
they're very clever that way with the word twisting. Because in everyday life, people say, well, he's a self-entitled bastard. So people in everyday life, they think of the word entitlement, and they think it's something abhorrent and in their minds it's a negative word, and so Republicans use that. I think they have maybe even a better sense of the mentality of the average American than maybe liberals and Democrats do, because sometimes I think that liberals and Democrats give people a little too much benefit of the doubt.
Well,
sometimes you think? Sometimes?
Well, it comes down to, once again, where they do that messaging of those elite Hollywood liberals, those elite liberals who think they're better than you. Whereas, my guy, remember George Bush, everybody, a lot of people liked him because, well, I could go and have a beer with that guy. That looks like somebody that I can go and have a beer with, and I can talk regular stuff with. But those stuffy Hollywood liberals, well, you can't talk to them because they'll snub their noses down at you. And that's the kind of message they put out. Well,
let me, as a Hollywood liberal myself, because I'm actually literally a stone's throw from Hollywood, from where they just did the Academy Awards a week ago. I live about a block or so away from there. I am one of those Hollywood liberals. At least I'm in Hollywood, and I'm a progressive. And I'm here to remind you that this is not an entitlement. It's a goddamn right that people died for, and not a whole long time ago. People died for recently in this country, and that's why the Voting Rights Act was passed. And this is something that this idea of democracy is something that Republicans have been pretending to give a damn about, have been pretending to want to spread around the world. We've got to spread democracy. And right here in this country, they don't give a damn about democracy. They don't give a damn about the right to vote. And they're willing to do any goddamn thing they can to undermine that right. And I find it unbelievably offensive. And to say, you know, for Scalia to call this a racial entitlement when, you know, there are people from the Civil Rights March that were, you know, beat up on the Edmund Pettus Bridge almost 50 years ago in this fight for civil rights. You know, Congressman John Lewis, who was sitting there in the courtroom, to call it a racial entitlement when he had his skull beaten in trying to fight for this right that he should have had at least 95 years earlier, since that's how long it took to do anything to enforce the 15th Amendment, is just so appalling that, you know, that should in of itself get a guy like Antonin Scalia just thrown off the goddamn court at this time, because he is just anything but what he pretends to be, and I find it appalling. And he is just, you know, he is everything that this nation is trying to no longer be, frankly. But other than that, I'm fine and a Hollywood fucking liberal.
Well said.
I think those are. I think we should count those as his final thoughts, because that was perfect.
Them were some.
Thank you.
Those were some excellent final thoughts. I tell you what, man, you couldn't have said it better. And one more thing that I think that I really want to add is that a lot of people seem to think that the fight for civil rights is over, but it's not over. It's a constant vigilance that you have to keep over your own civil rights, because at any day there is someone out there that doesn't want you to have those rights, whether you're poor, whether you're a minority, you know, black, Latino, Asian, whatever. Somebody wants to take those rights away because they will gain from it. They will gain something from it, and so you have to absolutely be 100% vigilant, and you have to not assume that the fight is over, because it will always go on. And the moment you let down your guard, that's when they'll come for it. And
beautifully put.
What about you?
Well said. Well said.
Thank you.
I don't know that I could beat either one of you right there. Those are beautiful final thoughts.
I'm sure you can come up with something.
The right to vote is so essential, and is something that desperately needs to be guarded. And it is a civil rights issue. And what Scalia basically did is deny the existence of racism, which infuriates me. Infuriates me that anyone could be so oblivious. That's not what he actually believes, though. It's because he's a racist, but he can't face it. He can't face himself as a racist and think of himself in that way. So people like that have to deny racism exists and that any of their actions are motivated by racism. So he's self-delusional, much like all of them. In some way or another, they are delusional.
I mean, it's only been, what, almost not even, pretty close to 100 years since we gained the right to vote.
Yeah, and not even 50 years since the Voting Rights Act. I think it's been 48 years. And so we've had 48 years since the Voting Rights Act, and yet it took 95 years to pass that Voting Rights Act since the 15th Amendment was written in 1870, and that was 100 years after our founding, after we put forward a document that says, you know, all men are created equal. Oh, except black people, good luck to you.
Here, I think, is the essential problem behind the issue and why people get into this delusion that racism is over, because they become so detached from their history, from their knowledge of history, and most of them are completely ignorant and uneducated, and this is another reason why Republicans hate education and want to keep people as ignorant as possible. You don't have a connection with your history, you don't understand the dates, you don't understand how recently these things have taken place in our history, you don't understand the patterns of things. There are ignorant people that are saying, well, slavery ended thus and such, about 200 years ago almost, and you say, well, everything wasn't fine the day after that. Do you understand how long it took? I mean, there was still, you didn't have slavery, but you did have sharecropping, which was basically slavery, and then the civil rights movement in the 60s was practically yesterday. My mom can remember the first group of black people coming to her school when they started integrating people,
and Rhiannon, the lynching and the poll taxes and the literacy tests and all of that.
Endless.
Yeah.
It's just endless. Right. And for someone who's educated, who understands their history, it's almost unfathomable that people would deny that racism exists today, and that it's still going to be a serious problem decades from now. I think I'm done.
And there it is. Well said, everybody. That was a great segment. Brad, you were on fire. Literally on fire.
Now I'm a little pissed. So, we've got to fight. If we have nothing else, if we don't have the right to vote in this country, if we don't have the right to vote and to have that vote counted and counted accurately, and we haven't even talked about that on this show, we'll do it on another time. But if we don't have that, we got nothing. That's the heartbeat of democracy, and that's exactly why we do what we do at bradblog.com. And guys, thank you. I do have to run, and I want to thank you guys though for having me here tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for showing up and hanging out with us. And I want to thank everybody who was watching. And thank you for joining TYT Community. If you guys want to be part of the show, just email me, tytcommunityshow@gmail.com. Brad, where can we find you?
Follow me on the Twitters at the Brad Blog. Like me at the Facebook at the Brad Blog, and of course we are bradblog.com. Come on by, help us raise hell, and don't forget, be the media, because somebody's got to. Thanks, guys.
Thanks a lot, Brad.
Great talking to you.
Thank you.
Great having you.
You bet.
Come do this again sometime.
Will do. Anytime. Thanks, guys.
All right. Rhi, where can we find you?
And yes, you can find me. I am the Lady Rhiannon at facebook.com/Lady Rhiannon824. You can find me on Twitter, and you can also find me Lady Rhiannon824.blogspot.com, and I also have my own channel called The Lady Rhiannon.
All right, and you can find me. You can follow me on Twitter at Jeff's Politics, and you can check out my YouTube channel. YouTube.com/JC Waldorf. It's another progressive show. Watch it, love it, subscribe to it. You know you want to. Thanks, everybody. Till next week.